can you tell us a little bit about some of those specific gaps in research and development that are long-standing gaps that we really need a lot of action from?
So then it's really quite depressing to see that conditions that affect women only in our portfolio, these conditions collectively only amount to less than 20% of the entire bucket. And if you include HIV in that, then it's less than 8%.
Right.
40% of all funding for sexual and reproductive health or women's health R&D is from the US government. That alone is quite scary. Just to be dependent on one country or one donor. Industry is most interested where there's a commercial incentive for them to invest. And that is, again, where we're seeing industry support for STIs, for vaccines, for therapeutics, for drugs. The least support is for female only and female specific conditions.
Welcome to the next episode of the Health Equity Podcast, where we speak to leaders around the world who are working with the pharmaceutical industry in bridging gaps on access to medicine for people living in low and middle income countries. Today's episode is part of the Through Her Lens campaign, where we speak specifically to women leaders who are part of this solution. They will talk through practical solutions that they're working on and how listeners and viewers can actually work on these solutions together. Today's guest is Maya Goldstein. She's the Director of Strategy and External Affairs in Impact Global Health. Welcome, Maya.
Thanks, Jay.
So could you tell us a little bit about Impact Global Health's work in defining gaps for research and development? How do you think that this actually lands with the pharmaceutical industry?
Sure. So Impact Global Health used to be called Policy Cues Research, so some people might know us by that name. We are a global health research organization, so we're dedicated to collecting and analyzing and sharing data on the landscape of global health R&D. We've been doing that for quite a long time now. In fact, one aspect we look at specifically is in funding for biomedical R&D. Mm-hmm. And we look at that for neglected diseases, emerging infectious diseases, and also in sexual and reproductive health. And we've been tracking neglected disease R&D funding since 2007. So that's almost 20 years now. So we've got quite a lot of trend data on who's spending, where they're spending, and what's going up and what's going down, and where the gaps are. We've also got, in the last couple of years, we've been collecting a lot of data on and filling out data sets on the comprehensive pipeline for a lot of these global health issues. That's really helpful to see what's actually being done as well as what's being spent, but like what kind of drugs are being developed, what stage they're at, and who's developing them. And we also have been, in the last couple of years, bringing a lot of this together and using that to analyze health and economic impact trends for particular contexts. We've done one in the UK recently, which looked at the ROI of investing in global health R&D, particularly for the UK domestic market. And we've done that globally as well. In the last couple of years, we brought together that data to look at the health and economic impact of investing in global health R&D, as well as looking at other types of analyses and answering other types of questions around where the gaps are and where the trends are lying.
I'd like to unpack a bit more about the sort of the funding trends that you're seeing and what does that mean for the future and how the industry needs to engage on that. But first off, I think, in the Access Medicine Foundation for 20 years, we've really been looking at using the gaps that you've identified alongside the gaps that the World Health Organization has identified, and putting the efforts of the pharmaceutical industry's data behind the pharmaceutical industry's efforts in R&D together to see, are these gaps actually being filled over time? And there's a number of significant gaps that are being filled, because I think when you have a consensus, a priority setting consensus like what Impact Global Health has been doing, it really makes a single, quite a clear path for the pharmaceutical industry to act on. And we've seen action taking. There are, however, many gaps that are still in place. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about some of those specific gaps in research and development that are long-standing gaps that we really need a lot of action from? And I know that Impact Global Health has been tracking biomedical research R&D for a long time, including in women's health. So what are some of those trends that you're seeing? Why is this very important?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. So we've been tracking our women's health journey really started in 2018, and that's actually when I joined. So I joined Policy Cues Research at Impact Global Health to restart the sexual and reproductive health part of our big project G Finder, which tracks global health funding. R&D funding. And back then, we were looking at a handful, maybe handful's not fair. We were looking at quite a few sexual and reproductive health issues where there was a significant burden in LMICs, there were product gaps, and there was a commercial market failure. This included some STIs, some maternal health issues, contraception, multi-purpose prevention technologies, and generally looking at platform technology, R&D funding as well. Back then, our mind was quite in the disease focus. So we were looking at it from really from an SRH, I'll use that acronym for sexual and reproductive, SRH lens. But obviously, as time has gone on, and I say we as the collective are much more cognizant that women's health is much broader than sexual and reproductive health. So I would say we were kind of using that SRH as an imperfect proxy for some of the major issues facing women and girls. But as time has gone on, the collective voice has been talking about how women's health is everything. It's things that affect them exclusively, yes, but also things that affect them differently than men and things that affect them disproportionately to men. This is a framework I think we're probably all really aware of. And at the same time, we at Impact Global Health in the last few years have taken a bit of a step back from SRH, just SRH, and thought, how can we apply a women's health lens more broadly to our work? And this is translated into us applying a feminist women's health lens to our entire portfolio to identify sex and gender inequities and market failures across our data and across the global health landscape. That sounds like word soup, but in practice, what that has meant is that we've expanded our scope on the SRH side quite a lot to include a lot more female-specific and female-centric health issues that have a big burden in LMICs. We'll come back to the dual market bit at the end, I guess. And there's a significant R&D gap. We've also started dabbling in applying a women's health lens to our other global health areas, to our data for neglected diseases and emerging infectious diseases. This is pretty nascent work, but includes things like looking to see how pregnant and lactating women have been involved in clinical trials for, say, malaria and Zika and HIV.
And what has the response been to some of these newer activities that Impact Global Health has been taking? Are you seeing that it's driving better decision making? Is there still a lot more sensitizing that you need to do to get more people to understand this over time?
Well, I don't think so. I think everyone's really talking about women's health so much now, which makes me so happy, and I'm sure it does you too. It's quite in the public domain, and also in our sector, people are talking about it a lot and are really interested. So I think the expansion of this scope and expansion of the way we're approaching women's health has been really well received. And I should say a lot of this work was done in conjunction with experts in the sector from various from industry, but also from funders and the advocacy side. So we had a lot of input to help us identify where we should be focusing efforts. And what it's meant is that we now have new data on not just the issues that we were collecting before, but on a whole bunch of gynecological conditions, which are really neglected, as well as some more maternal health conditions. And even though we only have long-term trend data from the first pool, what we're seeing is some real, there's a lot of stories coming out of the data, and it's really interesting. So I can share with you some of the top line pieces. We have seen a huge increase in funding for this women's health cohort over time, but I should say that that's largely because we now have a lot more conditions in our portfolio.
Right.
But in 2023, which is the latest, the most recent year that we have data for, there was about $860 million worth of funding. That sounds like quite a lot, but malaria has about 690 million in that single year. So it's comparative, the entire portfolio of women's health R&D is comparative to malaria. Where we are seeing some increases, though, is in STI R&D and things like platform technologies.
And why is that? Why are you seeing increases in funding? Is there more awareness? Is that more because the needs are greater and there's a stronger advocacy there? Is it new platforms of new funding that is emerging?
I think it's probably safe to say it's because there's a strong dual market for those products. Mm-hmm. So when you're thinking about the STIs, which are receiving increasing funding and interest, we're talking about gonorrhea, which has an AMR, antimicrobial resistance risk to it that is everywhere, particularly
affects
in
women in
countries.
all parts of the world.
Exactly. For example, genital herpes therapeutic vaccines, which have a huge commercial potential. Mm-hmm. So the funding we look at, I should just clarify, the funding we look at is agnostic about where it's going to, but it has to be applicable to LMIC settings. Right. So that's why we're seeing all this interest in the data that we have in places where there's this obvious dual market. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, women's health isn't a niche issue. It doesn't just affect, these issues don't just affect women in LMICs. Some do. There's, some maternal health issues have a much higher burden in low resource settings. But endometriosis, for example, affects women everywhere. So then it's really quite depressing to see that conditions that affect women only in our portfolio, endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, uterine fibroids, maternal health issues, abortion, these conditions collectively only amount to less than 20% of the entire bucket. And if you include HIV in that, then it's less than 8%.
Right. Where are you seeing the best and the least industry activity in solving some of these gaps? Because you're basically saying that there is funding available that is currently under quite a huge amount of threat, considering some of the competing priorities around the world and policies that governments are taking to become more centered on their populations across, instead of global health and global equity. Yeah. But there, at the end, the industry responds to working on issues where there's either a market or where there is a large need in that regard, right? So there must be areas where you've seen a lot of activity from the industry in working on these areas and partnering up on, in areas where there's the least. So where are the worst gaps in that sense that we need attention on?
So they kind of mirror the overall trends, actually. Right. So there is like 40% of all funding for sexual and reproductive health or women's health R&D is from the US government. That alone is quite scary. Wow. Just to be so dependent on one country or one donor, but also given the geopolitical context, right? It's quite a worry. Industry is most interested where there's a commercial incentive for them to invest. And that is, again, where we're seeing industry support for STIs, for vaccines, for therapeutics, for drugs.
Contraceptives.
For contraceptives has dipped a little bit, which is has been going up over the years and has dipped a little bit. We did see some interest from industry for multi-purpose prevention technologies, which was great because that's traditionally seen as a real public health, public sector funding pool. Yeah. But that's also dipped. Mm-hmm. And actually just the least support is for female only and female specific conditions. Wow. In fact, the ones that I mentioned, endometriosis, uterine fibroids, and PCOS, have none. Maternal health, like preeclampsia, preterm labor, postpartum hemorrhage, also quite low. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, the reasons I've just mentioned, I think there is a commercial incentive, right? Like I said, the 50% of the population across the world, and endometriosis is supposed to affect up to 10%. That's quite low. But even 10% is quite high if you're talking about the whole population.
Yeah.
I think uterine fibroids is almost up to 70%. So I think there is a commercial market there, but it just traditionally hasn't been seen that way. There's also the problem of the fact that we know so little about some of these conditions that the pipeline doesn't even exist. Like, we're really in the basic research realm. And in fact, we see in our data that most of these areas have a significant amount of funding in basic research and very early stage discovery. That's a great thing. That means at least that there's some interest in there, but it means we're starting from a really low base.
Right.
And getting industry interested at that point is pretty hard too.
Yeah.
And then this isn't industry's fault. This is our collective fault. But also, some of these conditions weren't even considered conditions until recently. They were just thought of women being in pain or complaining.
Right. But by having the data now organized and having a system that actually measures, how much investment is actually put in place, which you do, and a system that measures our specific companies invested in filling these gaps, which we do in the Access to Medicine Index, I think is helping to sort of measure the progress and drive the progress and define a path forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that accountability is one thing, and there's an incentive there to be part of something that is tracking improvement in the sector over time. But I think to really get industries money and interest and effort into the women's health space, we could do a lot, I think, to look elsewhere at where incentives have been really successful. I think both Impact Global Health and Access to Medicines Foundation were part of a recent white paper on regulatory reform for women's health, or innovation, that was driven by the Global Alliance for Women's Health. And it's a really great synthesis of some policy recommendations that could be really effective. Some, I think, quite low-hanging fruit. Some, I think, quite ambitious. But I think looking to the Orphan Drug Act and Orphan Drug Designation and what that did to rare disease drug approvals has gone from tens to hundreds since that was passed in the 80s. Things like priority review vouchers, financial incentives through grants and discounted insurance, price and volume guarantees, things that really will make it worthwhile for industry to put money in to de-risk slightly their investments in this space. I think could go a long way. But I do often think that there's a point where even all those incentives may not outweigh the costs, because the costs are expensive. When you start thinking about, you have to sex disaggregate all your data. You have to design your clinical trials to include women from the outset at a proportion that represents them in this particular disease area. Your sample size are getting bigger. Then you have, having to incorporate thinking about things which seem so tangentially related, but are actually really important to recruitment, like childcare, which is a big barrier to women participating in clinical trials. The costs start to add up. And I have, off the record, spoken to good friends in industry who just say, and at that point, it's like, we can't afford it. It just doesn't make sense.
So by identifying the problem, not necessarily having all the incentives ready, at the end, we're not really solving the issue, right? At the end, industry needs to really see that governments and in countries, there is the ability to absorb the new innovations that are coming forward.
Yeah.
But if we keep making everything more complex, and by nature, if you run clinical studies that include women, include pregnant women, lactating women, things are going to become more complex, more costly. We need to find a way to break those barriers, to re-incentivize the pharmaceutical industry to invest in these areas. Right? Rather than seeing it as, okay, hang on, the complexity just increased, the cost just increased.
Yeah.
That's a huge disincentive to work in it.
Absolutely.
No matter how much activism and need there is in the world.
Yeah.
That's the place that we're facing right now.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? So how can we break that?
Well,
tough question.
Tough question. I mean, I do think that there's two sides. So there's all the carrots, which is the incentives. And then there's maybe the stick, which is mandating some of this.
Right. Like how children, having a plan for children's care was built into approvals for products, perhaps, and using different types of incentives, right? An accelerated approval.
Yeah.
If you work on women's health, that could be helpful.
I think the pediatric that you're speaking of, the pediatric investigation plan rather, and from the EMA and the pediatric study plan from the FDA. Have done a lot to transform, which basically mandated label extensions for pediatric formulations, have done a lot to transform childhood medicines.
Yeah, and incentivize the industry to do more in that area. Yeah.
And I think we could do. It seems low-hanging fruit to me. Maybe I'm too ambitious, but it seems like we could do something like that for maternal health, in particular, to really break those barriers to the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials, in clinical research, in innovation.
Yeah. But at the end, you're also unlocking new markets.
Yeah.
Right? If you work on issues that affect 50% of the world's population, and you manage to get those products worked on and registered in multiple low and middle income countries, perhaps by joint registration systems that are in place, and systems are able to absorb that. Think of how much of an entire market you're unlocking.
Totally.
To finally meet the demands that are there in the world.
Absolutely.
Right.
It seems to me like an obvious commercial.
A logical dream.
Market. But having said that, we just spoke about all the barriers. It's tough right now.
Right.
And I think the ideas that we've just been speaking about, like, they're big ideas and they're ambitious. And they require a lot of coordination and buy-in and support from so many different layers. And I feel at this point quite hopeful that we're getting towards that point, because there's been so much talk and discussion around it in the last few years alone. But translating talk into action, I guess, is another step. So
what's really important is to not only identify a gap where there's an unmet medical need, right? So there's a condition in the world where there's no treatment, for example, or no diagnostic. But what it can really drive is the definition of something called a target product profile, where you need to not only define that you need a product, but you need to start defining things like, will it be used in heat-stable conditions? What is the preferred route of administration? Should it be oral or dispersible? Or IV, because often this condition is for patients who are unconscious or hospitalized. And doses, right? Is it going to be a microdose or a macro dose in that sense? So a lot of these components are part of something called a target product profile. So tell me a little bit about how your research and your data can be put into practice in helping define these product profiles and eventually helping to define companies working on it, because we really see that companies don't always only have the compound available for the final product, but they sometimes have expertise in formulations. They sometimes have expertise, and we've seen partnerships for schistosomiasis, partnerships where companies get together to work on products and formulations to work together on a profile of a product. So tell me a little bit about how this can be put into practice and what some of the activities you've been doing on this.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. So, I mean, our data can just be our data, and it can be an accountability tool like we've spoken of. But we also have such a depth of detail in what's going on in the space, particularly in the pipeline databases, which look at all marketed products, what's available currently, and also what's in development at various different stages. You can just stop there, and it's interesting, but to your point, I mean, what can we and what have we and what should we do with that data? Our goal and our aim would be for someone to look at that and say, okay, so that looks promising, that looks good, that doesn't, that's where I'm going to focus my energy. And there have actually been some really interesting projects that we've worked on and partnerships where we've taken that step further and worked with a team to do that prioritization work. A good example, and in the women's health space, has been a partnership called Accelerating Innovations for Mothers, which was is still going, a partnership between Impact Global Health, Concept Foundation, and the Burnett Institute and Melbourne University. And initially, and it's evolved over time, but initially it was really trying to look at closing the loop in the gaps in the maternal health R&D landscape. This started with us doing a huge piece of work looking at what is currently in development for 5 specific maternal health conditions like preeclampsia, postpartum hemorrhage, preterm labor, etc. And once we did that, we as a consortium then also began to look at what the ideal product profile might look for a drug for these different conditions. Because, and these are called TPPs, the target product profiles. These didn't exist for these, for preeclampsia, for preterm labor. So we spent a lot of time working with the sector, with a lot of input from experts to develop a specific target product profile for a ideal preeclampsia drug and an ideal prevention and treatment and an ideal preterm labor drug, for example. What we then did is took that TPP and matched it to what was in the pipeline database that we had. And we were able to use a set of criteria which were drawn from the TPP to say, well, this candidate is high potential, this is medium potential, and this is low potential. And at the end, when you're sieving it out, I think as an example, for preeclampsia, there was maybe 87 candidates in development. And when we sieved them out, there was 7 that we'd categorized as high potential. And nearly all of them, I think, are repurposed medicines. Right. So there's quite a lot of meat there, but there's also quite a lot of direction. You can get to the point where you say, actually, this is where we should be focusing our energy. This would give a really good bet on a return.
Right. And at the end, the more you create these target product profiles, and you put it through that sieving exercise towards all the products that are there, you might actually find a lot more engagement from the pharmaceutical industry to say, look, feel free to take all our activities and tell us, which products are more likely to succeed in addressing this particular condition. It also lowers the risk and the cost for the industry. Yeah. Right. And that's been a model that the industry has been actively working on for neglected tropical diseases, to say, here are all our compounds tested against the diseases, and then it's easier for us all to make choices on what's going to be a successful product. Yeah. In the future. And I do think AI can help a lot in some of those data sieving to mine all the, as you said, repurposed medicines in the world. Yeah. Right. So our data is there to make change. And, we've done, as I said, 20 years of complementary work in sort of developing the data towards making very clear recommendations, identifying best practices when we do see the industry working on some of these issues, and highlighting and rewarding the ones that actually are on board in some of these difficult areas, right? And over the years, we have seen there's very few pharmaceutical companies that really work on women-specific R&D, women-specific access. And now that the space is expanded more to include conditions that also affect women, cardiovascular, diabetes, cancers, you've really seen that there's a lot more interest and there's more activity around it. But sustaining that over time is the big problem that we face, and really bridging some of the most horrible gaps in the world is sort of the challenge. So what's your message to listeners right now? Because listeners can be from investment firms that invest in the pharmaceutical industry. Listeners can be advocates in women's health, advocates in R&D. Listeners can be the pharmaceutical industry, members from the top to all across the world in the pharmaceutical industry. And listeners can be people like you and me.
My message to everyone at this point is I feel excited by all of the momentum around women's health at the moment. And I would hate for it to fizzle out because we get to a point where we have all the ideas, which I think we're getting to that point. We have really good ideas and we kind of know where we want to go, but it suddenly just seems a bit too hard and then fizzles away.
Right.
I think we have a collective responsibility from all of our different sectors to keep the momentum going and to actually start translating words into action. I think we know what to do, actually. I just think that we're at the pointy end now where we just need to make it work and make it happen.
So look for areas that you can influence as a listener, as a viewer.
Yeah.
Whether if you're an investor, try to see what are things that you can mandate.
Yeah.
Speak to companies about their women's health activities, for example. If you're a member of the community, advocate for better policies.
Yeah.
Advocate for women to speak up about their needs, what works, what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Advocate for people to go forward and ask for choices, because some of the products are actually already available, but you need choices in your health journey in that sense. And if you're in an industry, speak up internally to see what other access programs that are maybe running in one therapeutic area or one part of the world that can be applied or modified to actually improve women's health.
Yeah.
So there's many different messages that can come from this. And I think there's a lot of data available to help support those.
There
actions,
is, yeah. And I should give a little plug that all of our data is on our website, so you can
freely available.
You can interact with it how you like and make your own charts. But we also have these really great analyses that we've written up that analyze the funding data, also some of the pipeline databases we have. And look at funding trends over time. And we also have all of our impact analyses as well available on our website.
Thanks, Maya, for being here and for sharing your insights.
Thanks so much for having me.
In today's episode, you've heard about the power of biomedical research and development and how organizations such as the Impact Global Health and Access to Medicine Foundation has been working for years in identifying the right data to bridge these gaps so that the pharmaceutical industry and their partners can address some of the biggest problems in the world. You've also heard that there are several gaps in that we need to still solve in women's health R&D. And these are conditions that affect up to 50% of the world's population today. Our data, our insights are freely available, but we cannot make the change that we want to make in society without the power of you using these research in your sector. Whether you're an investor, a member of the pharmaceutical industry, a member of government, an advocate, a member of the community, use our research and please reach out if you see an opportunity to work together. Thank you very much for listening.